The Mediterranean world at the dawn of the 3rd century before Christ was a cauldron of ambition, rivalry, and empire building. Two powers, once distant, had grown into uneasy neighbors destined for collision. To the west, Carthage, the great maritime power of the Phoenician world, commanded the seas, her merchants stretching trade networks from the coast of North Africa to the far reaches of Spain and the Atlantic beyond. To the east, Rome, a city that had once been an upstart among Italian rivals, had forged a confederation of allies and subjugated foes, uniting the Italian peninsula under her iron grip. Their paths had already crossed once in Sicily, and the clash had been long and bitter. For more than 2 decades, the First Punic War consumed lives and fortunes, ending only when Rome seized Sicily and forced Carthage to accept humiliating terms. The scars of that war were not only etched upon the landscape, but also upon the hearts of both peoples. Carthage emerged battered but unbroken, a proud city compelled to look elsewhere for strength. It was in Iberia, across the seas in the rich lands of Spain, that Carthage rebuilt her fortunes. Under the leadership of the Barcid family, first Hamilcar and then his son-in-law Hasdrubal, the Carthaginians forged a new dominion. Silver mines poured wealth into Carthage's coffers, soldiers were recruited from Iberian tribes, and a new power base took shape that would once again challenge Rome. To the Romans this was a troubling development, though their gaze remained fixed elsewhere, confident in the peace they had imposed. But within the Barcid household, there burned a fire that peace could not extinguish. Among them was a young man whose destiny was bound to Rome's destruction. Hannibal, son of Hamilcar Barca, had been raised in the shadow of Carthage's defeat. According to legend, as a boy he was brought by his father to the altar of Baal, the god of Carthage. There he was made to swear a solemn oath that he would never be a friend to Rome, that he would carry in his heart a hatred unyielding and eternal. Whether or not the tale is true, it captured the essence of Hannibal's character. He was nurtured in war, educated in strategy, and inspired by his father's vision of restoring Carthaginian honor. The death of Hamilcar in battle against Iberian tribes left Hasdrubal the Fair to command the Carthaginian expansion in Spain. Hasdrubal extended Carthage's influence with diplomacy as much as with force, establishing alliances and founding the great city of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, as the jewel of their Spanish dominion. Rome, wary but cautious, struck a treaty with Hasdrubal in 226 BC, recognizing Carthage's power in Spain, but drawing a line at the river Ebro, north of which Carthage promised not to march. Yet treaties, like all human compacts, depended on men's wills, and the wills of these peoples were set on collision. When Hasdrubal was assassinated, command fell to Hannibal, still a young man but already seasoned by years of campaigning. His appointment electrified the Carthaginian armies in Spain, for the soldiers admired him not only as a leader, but as one of their own, a man who shared their hardships, who ate at their fires, who fought at their side. In him, Carthage found the general who would define an era. It was in 219 BC that the spark was struck, which ignited the greatest war of the ancient world. The city of Saguntum, lying south of the Ebro but allied to Rome, became the flashpoint. Hannibal laid siege to it, claiming Carthage's rights in Spain, while Rome declared that any assault upon Saguntum would be an act of war. For 8 months the siege dragged on. The Saguntines, though brave, were cut off and overwhelmed. When the city finally fell, its people slaughtered or enslaved, the fate of the Mediterranean was sealed. Rome sent envoys to Carthage, demanding Hannibal's surrender. The Carthaginian Senate debated but would not yield him up, for Hannibal embodied their defiance. One Roman envoy, in a moment that became legend, held out the folds of his toga to the Carthaginian elders, declaring that within it he carried peace or war, and that they must choose. Carthage replied, "Let it be war." And with those words the Second Punic War began. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the world had ever seen. Rome, mistress of Italy, with legions hardened by conquest, was confident in her strength. Carthage, humiliated once but now revitalized, trusted in the genius of a commander who would soon march across mountains and rivers to strike at the very heart of his enemy. The Mediterranean trembled at the prospect of what was to come, For this war would not be fought only for territory or pride, but for the very survival of Rome itself. When the Carthaginian council chose war, they chose not only conflict but destiny, and destiny bore the name of Hannibal Barca. He was not content to fight the Romans on the soil of Spain or defend the shores of Africa. His imagination was bolder, his ambition boundless. To defeat Rome, he would carry the struggle to Italy itself, tearing the war from distant provinces to the very homeland of his enemy. It was a plan as audacious as it was perilous, for never before had Rome been threatened with invasion from beyond the Alps. Hannibal's first moves were swift and calculated. He secured his base in Spain, binding the Iberian tribes more tightly to Carthage through promises, displays of generosity, and relentless discipline. He left his brother Hasdrubal in charge of Carthago Nova, with orders to safeguard the mines and secure reinforcements. Then, in the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal assembled his army. It was a force drawn from many nations, hardy Iberians with curved swords, nimble Balearic slingers whose stones could crack helmets, Numidian cavalry famed for their speed and cunning, Libyan infantry trained in Carthaginian discipline, and elephants, the towering beasts whose sight alone struck terror into foes unused to their presence. This was no single people's army, but a coalition bound by Hannibal's will. Rome, for its part, prepared to carry the war into Spain and Africa, trusting in its naval supremacy. One consular army, under Publius Cornelius Scipio, was dispatched to Spain to pin Hannibal down, while another, led by Tiberius Sempronius Longus, made ready to cross to Africa. Yet Hannibal, always a step ahead, moved before these forces could close in. He marched his men across the river Ebro, a direct challenge to Rome's treaty, and swept aside resistance from tribes loyal to the Romans. But this was only the beginning. His gaze was fixed north across the Pyrenees, across Gaul and across the Alps, toward the prize of Italy. The march was an ordeal that would have broken lesser men and lesser armies. Hannibal's crossing of the Pyrenees tested his soldiers first, as tribes resisted his advance and sought to block the way. Battles were fought on narrow passes, rivers were forced under arrow fire, but Hannibal's charisma and ruthlessness carried his men forward. By the time they reached the Rhone, his army had already endured privation, yet they pressed on. At the Rhone, Roman scouts discovered Hannibal's presence, and Publius Scipio himself hastened from Massilia to intercept him. But Hannibal's cavalry clashed with the Romans, delaying them, and by the time Scipio sought a decisive engagement, Hannibal had already vanished upriver, avoiding battle and striking for the high passes of the Alps. It was there, in the looming shadow of snowbound peaks, that Hannibal undertook his most famous and desperate march. The Alps were no single barrier, but a labyrinth of treacherous passes, hostile tribes, and brutal elements. Ancient sources tell of avalanches, of men and beasts tumbling into chasms, of soldiers clawing their way through snow and ice. Hannibal's elephants, symbols of his power, struggled on narrow paths where sheer cliffs plunged into mist below. At times, tribes attacked from above, hurling stones and rolling boulders down upon the weary Carthaginians. Hannibal himself was said to have stood at the front, rallying his men, promising them that beyond these mountains lay the rich plains of Italy, ripe for plunder and glory. The hardships were immense, thousands perished, and the army that emerged from the Alps was but a shadow of the host that had set out from Spain. Yet it was enough. Hannibal descended into the valley of the Po in the late autumn of 218 BC, with perhaps 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of surviving elephants. He had done the impossible, crossed mountains thought impassable with a fighting force intact, and in doing so, he had stunned the world. Rome reeled at the news. Never had a foreign enemy brought war so directly to their soil. Never had they faced the prospect of an invader entrenched in northern Italy. Publius Scipio, who had failed to prevent Hannibal's passage, returned hastily from Gaul and, with his colleague Sempronius Longus, prepared to confront the Carthaginian menace. They expected an easy contest against an army weakened by the Alpine ordeal. They believed the legions, with their discipline and numbers, would sweep aside these foreigners who had dared to trespass upon Italy. But Hannibal's genius was only beginning to reveal itself. The clash came first along the banks of the Ticinus River. Here Scipio, leading his cavalry, sought to probe Hannibal's strength. What he found instead was the brilliance of the Numidian horsemen, who swarmed the Romans with speed and skill. In the melee, Scipio himself was wounded and narrowly rescued by his teenage son, also named Publius Scipio, a youth destined to one day face Hannibal on far greater fields. The Romans withdrew shaken. Soon after, on the Trebia River, Hannibal sprang his first great trap. In the bitter cold of December, he lured Sempronius Longus into battle. Hannibal's men feigned retreat across the icy waters, and when the eager Romans pursued, soaked and chilled, they found themselves surrounded. From hidden ground, Hannibal's brother Mago led an ambush force that struck their flank, while the elephants and cavalry crashed upon them. The Roman army was annihilated, thousands cut down or captured, the survivors fleeing in terror. Italy trembled. In the space of weeks, Hannibal had brought Rome to its knees in battle, proving that his battered multinational army could not only survive, but triumph. For Rome, this was more than defeat. It was a wound to their pride, a revelation that the legions were not invincible. For Hannibal, it was vindication, the first step in a campaign that would make his name immortal. But this was only the beginning. Ahead lay greater battles, greater dangers, and greater gambles, as Hannibal pressed deeper into the Italian heartland, and Rome gathered its strength for a struggle that would last nearly 2 decades. The winter snows melted, and the year 217 before Christ dawned, with Rome's confidence shaken but not broken. The Republic had suffered defeat, but the Senate, hardened by centuries of struggle, resolved that Hannibal must be confronted again. New consuls were chosen, Gaius Flaminius among them, a man of popular zeal but reckless ambition. He had risen to prominence by defying the Senate, appealing directly to the people, and now sought to redeem Rome's honor with bold action. Hannibal knew his kind well. To Hannibal, such men were prey. Through the Apennines, Hannibal marched, his elephants dying in the cold, his men wearied yet hardened by every trial. He drove his army into the rich lands of Etruria, leaving devastation in his wake, burning villages, seizing supplies, drawing Rome's forces after him. The Romans were furious, the countryside terrified. Yet Hannibal's plan was not mere destruction, it was bait. He knew Flaminius, impatient for glory, would pursue him without caution. Near Lake Trasimene, Hannibal set his trap. The terrain favored deception, wooded hills descending into a narrow road along the lakeshore. At dawn, as Flaminius marched his legions through the mist, Hannibal's concealed soldiers sprang upon them. From the hills above, Carthaginian infantry surged down. From the flanks, cavalry thundered. From the front, Hannibal's men blocked escape. The Romans were caught in a vast ambush, their formation broken, their commander cut down amid the chaos. So complete was the surprise that thousands were slain before they could even draw their swords. The waters of Lake Trasimene ran red, and Rome's army was annihilated. Panic gripped the Republic. In less than a year, Hannibal had destroyed 2 consular armies and brought Italy to the brink of collapse. Refugees poured into the city, bearing tales of slaughter. The Senate, grim and unyielding, did not sue for peace. Instead, they turned to an ancient remedy in times of crisis, the appointment of a dictator. Quintus Fabius Maximus was chosen, a man of patience and gravity, who counseled caution where others demanded battle. His strategy was simple: avoid direct confrontation with Hannibal, harass his supply lines, wear him down with time and scarcity. It was a strategy mocked by many who derided him as cunctator, the delayer, but it preserved Rome from further annihilation. Hannibal, meanwhile, sought to fracture Rome's alliances. He marched through Umbria, Campania, and Apulia, devastating the land, hoping that Rome's Italian allies would abandon her. Some wavered, but most stood firm, for Rome's power, though shaken, still loomed large. Frustrated by Fabius' caution, Hannibal maneuvered to draw him out, even seizing herds of cattle, tying torches to their horns, and driving them at night to create the illusion of a massive retreat. The ruse baffled the Romans, but Fabius refused to give chase. Hannibal could win battles, but the war remained elusive. The following year, however, Rome abandoned caution. 2 new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, were given command. Varro, a man of low birth and fiery temper, clamoured for decisive battle. Paulus, more prudent, counselled restraint. Their alternating command brought disunity, and Hannibal, always attuned to weakness, prepared to exploit it. It was in the summer of 216 BC, on the plains of Cannae in Apulia, that Hannibal achieved his greatest triumph. The Romans, numbering perhaps 80,000, the largest army they had ever assembled, marched to crush him. Hannibal, with half that number, chose his ground with care. He placed his weakest troops, the Iberians and Gauls, in the centre, his veterans and cavalry on the wings. He arranged his line in a crescent bulging toward the enemy. When the battle began, the Roman legion surged forward, pressing the Carthaginian centre backward. It seemed Hannibal's line was collapsing, and Varro exulted in victory. But the retreat was calculated. As the Romans pressed in, the crescent bent inward, drawing them deeper into a trap. On the flanks, Hannibal's African infantry wheeled inward like closing jaws, while his cavalry, led by the brilliant Maharbal, had already routed the Roman horse and now struck the legions from behind. Surrounded on all sides, the Roman army was trapped, a vast mass of men pressed together, unable to fight or flee. The slaughter was unimaginable. For hours the Carthaginians cut down their enemies, until the field was heaped with Roman dead. Some say 50,000 Romans fell that day, including Paulus, many senators, and the flower of Rome's nobility. It was the most devastating defeat in the history of the Republic. Never again would Rome suffer such a calamity in a single battle. Hannibal had destroyed not just an army, but the illusion of Roman invincibility. In the aftermath, Italy quaked. Many of Rome's allies now defected. Capua, the second city of Italy, threw open its gates to Hannibal, while others hesitated between loyalty and survival. Macedon, across the Adriatic, entered into alliance with Carthage, threatening a new front. Even in Sicily and Sardinia, murmurs of rebellion spread. Rome seemed on the verge of collapse. And yet, Hannibal did not march upon the city itself. When urged by his cavalry commander Maharbal to seize Rome, Hannibal demurred, claiming the time was not yet ripe. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal," Maharbal is said to have declared, "but not how to use it." Whether Hannibal could have taken Rome is debated, but the decision would echo through history. For though Rome was wounded, she was not slain, and her resilience would prove the equal of Hannibal's genius. The war had reached its climax in blood and terror. Hannibal stood supreme in Italy, master of battle, scourge of the legions. But the Republic, though beaten, would not bow. A struggle of endurance now began, a war not merely of armies, but of wills, as Rome resolved to fight on to the bitter end. After the catastrophe at Cannae, Rome seemed poised to collapse under the weight of its losses. Yet the Republic, unlike so many states before it, did not sue for peace. The Senate, even as it mourned sons and fathers, voted to continue the war. Citizens swore oaths to never abandon the Republic. Women offered their jewels to fund the defense, and the city braced for siege. The dead of Cannae were buried in shallow pits, but their sacrifice became the foundation of a new resolve. For Rome understood that defeat in battle was not defeat in war, so long as her spirit endured. The strategy of survival now took precedence. Quintus Fabius Maximus, once mocked as the delayer, was vindicated. His cautious approach became Rome's shield against Hannibal's brilliance. Roman armies shadowed Hannibal from afar, refusing to be lured into battle, striking at foragers, cutting supply lines, harassing allies who wavered. It was an unglamorous strategy, one that required restraint in a culture that glorified courage, but it preserved Rome's strength. Hannibal, unable to force battle, found himself a lion prowling in a cage of stone. Yet his presence in Italy was no less devastating. From his new base in Capua, Hannibal radiated terror across the peninsula. Cities shifted loyalties, Roman allies wavered, and whole regions fell into rebellion. But Rome responded with brutal efficiency. Those who defected paid a heavy price. Towns that welcomed Hannibal were besieged, their inhabitants enslaved, their walls torn down. Rome understood that this war was as much about allegiance as arms, and through fear as much as loyalty, she bound Italy to her cause. The years that followed became a grim contest of endurance. Hannibal marched through Apulia, Lucania, Campania, even into Bruttium in the far south, seeking allies, plunder, and the decisive blow that would bring Rome to terms. He won battles still, at Herdonia, at Silurus, but none with the scale of Cannae. Each victory weakened Rome's armies, but never broke the Republic's resolve, and slowly, inevitably, Rome replenished her ranks. Year after year, the legions were raised anew, citizen and ally alike pressed into service, until the losses of Cannae became a memory carried on by widows and orphans, but not a wound that could kill. The wider world, too, was drawn into the struggle. Philip V of Macedon, enticed by Hannibal's victories, sought alliance with Carthage, but Rome countered swiftly, forging bonds with Greek states opposed to Macedon, ensuring Hannibal's potential ally could not land in Italy. In Sicily, Carthage sought to rekindle rebellion, but the Roman grip tightened, especially once Syracuse, long a semi-independent power, was brought into play. And there, amid the war, the genius of Archimedes, the great mathematician, turned his mind to engines of defense. Catapults hurled stones, claws lifted ships from the sea, and for years Syracuse resisted Roman might. Only treachery within brought her low, and Archimedes himself was cut down despite orders to spare him. His death was a tragedy of the war, but his city's fall sealed Sicily once more under Rome's rule. In Spain, meanwhile, the Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus, carried the fight to Carthage's lifeline. For it was in Iberia that Carthage drew her silver and men, the resources that sustained Hannibal's army. The Scipios won allies among the Celtiberians, clashed with Carthaginian generals, and for a time seemed poised to sever Hannibal's support. But Carthage struck back. Both brothers fell in battle, their armies shattered, and Iberia once more became a Carthaginian stronghold. Hannibal's cause seemed secure, yet from this disaster arose a figure who would change the course of history. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son who had saved his father at the Ticinus, now took command in Spain at a remarkably young age. Charismatic, daring, and brilliant, Scipio embodied Rome's answer to Hannibal. While Hannibal still roamed Italy undefeated, Scipio in Spain began to dismantle Carthage's empire piece by piece, forging alliances with Iberian tribes, seizing Carthago Nova in a lightning strike, and proving himself a commander of rare genius. Though distant from Italy, his victories would one day bring the war to Africa itself. Back in Italy, Hannibal's fortunes grew strained. His brother Hasdrubal, entrusted with reinforcements in Spain, at last resolved to march to his aid. Crossing the Alps, as Hannibal had years before, Hasdrubal descended into northern Italy with an army, offering the promise of reunion. If the Barca brothers could join forces, the fate of Rome might again hang in the balance. But Rome intercepted their plans, and at the Metaurus River in 207 BC, Hasdrubal's army was trapped and destroyed. His head, severed, was thrown into Hannibal's camp. When Hannibal beheld it, he knew the dream of reinforcements was dead, and with it much of his hope for ultimate victory. Still, Hannibal endured. For more than a decade he held out in southern Italy, defying every Roman attempt to corner him. He was a shadow of his former power, his army diminished, his cause eroded, yet his presence remained a dagger in Rome's side. The war had become global, stretching from Spain to Sicily, from Macedon to Africa. But always the heart of it beat in Italy, where Hannibal refused to yield. He had shown Rome her mortality, and for that alone his name became legend. But legends do not win wars without substance, and Carthage's substance was dwindling. Rome had weathered the storm, adapted her strategy, and found new leaders to carry her cause. The tide was turning, and soon the war would shift from Italy's soil to the homeland of Carthage itself. As the years dragged on, the war that had begun with Hannibal's audacious march into Italy transformed into something greater than a struggle between two men. It became a contest of empires, fought across seas and continents, draining treasuries, consuming generations of warriors, and reshaping the very balance of the ancient world. Hannibal, once the hunter, now lingered as prey, his army dwindling in the hills of Bruttium, while Rome, battered but unbroken, grew stronger with each passing season. In Spain, where the Scipio brothers had perished, the Republic placed its faith in the young Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was little more than a youth, untested in high command, Yet his election to leadership spoke not only of desperation, but of the brilliance already visible in his character. Scipio did not govern like other Roman generals. He understood the power of mercy, of spectacle, of inspiration. Where others demanded obedience through fear, Scipio won loyalty with generosity and vision. He treated allies with respect. He honored the customs of Iberian tribes, and through this he forged bonds where Carthage had ruled through dominance alone. His first great stroke came in 209 BC, when he struck at the beating heart of Carthaginian power in Spain, the city of Carthago Nova. Guarded lightly while Carthaginian armies campaigned elsewhere, the city fell to Scipio in a daring assault, his men wading through the shallow lagoon at low tide, scaling walls thought impregnable. Within its gates lay immense stores of silver, weapons, hostages, and supplies, all of which now flowed into Roman hands. More than material, it was symbolic. Carthage's proud colony, jewel of the Barcid dominion, was now Roman, and the tribes of Iberia began to turn. One by one, Scipio defeated Carthaginian commanders. At Baecula, he struck Hasdrubal Barca as he attempted to march north into Gaul, forcing him away though not capturing him. At Ilipa, in 206 BC, Scipio delivered his masterpiece. Facing an army larger than his own, he reversed the traditional deployment, placing his strongest legions on the wings rather than the center. As the Carthaginians pressed forward, expecting a standard contest, Scipio's wings enveloped them, cutting them down in a mirror image of Hannibal's tactics at Cannae. With this battle, Iberia was lost to Carthage. The mines, the manpower, the resources that had fed Hannibal's war were gone. Carthage's empire was shrinking, her strength bleeding away. Meanwhile, in Italy, Hannibal endured, yet his power was fading. The great experiment of breaking Rome's alliances had failed. Though many had wavered after Cannae, most of Italy remained loyal, or had been brutally forced back into line. Capua, his proud ally, was recaptured by Rome in 211 BC after a long siege, its leaders executed, its people punished. The dream of tearing Italy from Rome's grasp evaporated with each passing year. Hannibal remained undefeated in pitched battle, but victory without strategic effect became meaningless. He was an exile within the land he had once sought to conquer, a spectre haunting the southern hills. The Senate, emboldened by Scipio's victories in Spain, began to think beyond mere survival. If Hannibal could not be destroyed in Italy, perhaps Carthage could be forced to recall him by striking at her homeland. It was an audacious thought, one that demanded bold leadership. Many Romans hesitated, wary of overreach, but Scipio pressed for it relentlessly. He argued that the war could only end when Carthage itself felt the terror of invasion, just as Rome had felt under Hannibal. Before such a plan could be attempted, Scipio secured Sicily as his base. There he rebuilt his army not only with Roman veterans, but with allies, volunteers, and exiles eager for revenge. He trained them with intensity, drilling them in new tactics, emphasizing flexibility and speed. Among them were survivors of Cannae, men once disgraced, now given a chance to redeem themselves under his command. Scipio inspired in them not merely obedience but devotion. He was no longer just a Roman commander. He was the embodiment of a cause, the promise of Rome's resurgence. Carthage, meanwhile, still possessed allies. Numidia, the kingdom of skilled horsemen to the south, remained divided between rival princes, Syphax and Massinissa. At first, Syphax aligned with Carthage, while Massinissa sought Roman friendship. It was a contest of diplomacy as much as arms, and Scipio proved as adept in persuasion as in battle. Through charm and cunning, he drew Massinissa firmly into Rome's camp, gaining the most formidable cavalry of the ancient world. Carthage's last advantage, the swift horsemen of Numidia, was slipping away. By 204 BC, Scipio was ready. With Senate approval at last secured, he crossed into Africa, bringing the war to Carthage's own soil. Hannibal, still in Italy, could only watch as the tide of destiny turned. His homeland, which had entrusted him with the dream of vengeance, now called him back for its salvation. The duel that had begun decades earlier was nearing its final act, and the plains of Africa would provide the stage upon which the fate of empires would be decided. When Scipio's fleet set sail from Sicily and landed upon the shores of Africa, the war that had scarred Italy for more than a decade suddenly changed its shape. No longer was Rome the hunted and Carthage the hunter. Now the roles were reversed. Panic swept the Carthaginian countryside as Roman legions disembarked, torching villages, storming outposts, and spreading terror across the fertile plains that had for centuries fed the Carthaginian heart. The Senate of Carthage, once haughty and unyielding, now found itself in frantic council, scrambling for allies. Their first hope lay in Syphax, king of western Numidia, who commanded large armies and had long leaned toward their side. Syphax's warriors, with their swift javelins and light horse, were a force to rival Rome's best. Together with Carthaginian troops under Hasdrubal Gisgo, Syphax assembled an army said to outnumber Scipio's nearly 2-1. Yet numbers, as history had already shown, were not always the measure of victory. The contest came swiftly. At first, Scipio courted Syphax with diplomacy, playing upon his rivalries with Massinissa, the Numidian prince who had thrown his lot in with Rome. But Syphax resisted. War was inevitable. At the Great Plains of Africa, Scipio unleashed the discipline of his veterans against the sprawling Carthaginian Numidian host. Roman maniples advanced with precision, their lines holding firm against repeated charges, while Massinissa's horsemen clashed furiously with their kin. The battle turned when the Carthaginian lines broke under the pressure of Roman discipline and Numidian betrayal. Syphax was captured, his cause shattered, and with him Carthage lost its strongest ally. Yet victory did not come without fire. Before the decisive confrontation, Syphax and Hasdrubal had encamped near Scipio with vast forces. Scipio, employing trickery worthy of Hannibal himself, launched a night raid that set the enemy's camp ablaze. Confusion and terror spread as soldiers stumbled in smoke and flame, cut down before they could form ranks. It was a victory not of sheer force, but of cunning. And it shook Carthage's confidence to its core. Massinissa, now firmly aligned with Rome, proved more than an ally. His Numidian cavalry became the hammer of Scipio's army, outmaneuvering and outmatching Carthaginian riders who once had dominated Mediterranean battlefields. The balance of power in Africa tilted decisively. Back in Carthage, fear mounted. The Senate, desperate, at last sent word across the sea to their most famous son. Hannibal Barca, who had spent 15 years waging war in Italy, was summoned home. It was a bitter call. For Hannibal, Italy had been the stage of his life, the land where he had crushed legions, humbled consuls, and brought Rome to the brink of ruin. Yet now, as Carthage itself trembled, he could not refuse. Gathering what remained of his veterans, hardened men who had followed him through every hardship since the Alps, he embarked for Africa. The sight of Hannibal's return rekindled hope among the Carthaginians. Here was the man who had triumphed at Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae. Here was the general who had made Rome itself quake. If anyone could rescue Carthage, it was Hannibal. Yet the Hannibal who returned was not the youthful commander aflame with vengeance, but an older man tempered by years of endless campaigning, carrying the weight of lost opportunities. He knew the scale of the challenge before him. Scipio, for his part, welcomed the prospect. All his life he had lived in Hannibal's shadow, the enemy who had slain his father, and uncle, the genius whose victories had shaped his youth. Now fate had brought them face to face, not in Italy, not in Spain, but in Africa, upon the soil of Carthage itself. It was more than a contest of armies. It was a duel between two of the greatest commanders the world had ever known. Before battle was joined, the two men met. On neutral ground, Hannibal and Scipio conversed, the old master and the rising star. They spoke not as enemies hurling threats, but as soldiers who recognized in each other the weight of destiny. Hannibal offered terms, warning Scipio of the uncertainty of fortune, suggesting that Rome take what it had already won, rather than risk all upon a single day. But Scipio, confident in his men, in his cavalry, in the tide of history itself, refused to bend. He believed the gods had delivered Hannibal into his hands, and he would not let the chance slip away. So the two returned to their camps, each knowing that the morrow would decide not only the fate of Rome and Carthage, but their own place in history. The fields near the town of Zama would become the crucible in which empires were forged and broken. And there, under the African sun, the Second Punic War would reach its climax. The plain near Zama was broad and open, its dry earth stretching toward the horizon beneath the blazing African sun. Here in 202 BC, Two armies gathered, each aware that the destiny of nations would be decided in a single clash. On one side stood Hannibal, commander of Carthage, the man who had crossed the Alps and shattered Roman legions, now returned to his homeland with veterans who had marched with him through every hardship. On the other stood Publius Cornelius Scipio, young, audacious, and resolute, bearing the weight of Rome's hopes and the determination to end once and for all the war that had nearly undone his people. Hannibal's army was a patchwork of Carthaginian citizens, levies raised in haste, mercenaries from every corner of Africa, and his beloved veterans from Italy, scarred men who had fought beside him for over a decade. Most striking of all were the 80 war elephants drawn up at the front, massive beasts whose trumpeting shook the air. Though Hannibal knew their value was uncertain, he hoped they might at least disrupt the disciplined Roman legions and open the way for his infantry. Behind the elephants stood lines of mercenaries, Gauls, Ligurians, and Numidians pressed into Carthage's service. Behind them, the Carthaginian citizens themselves, and finally at the rear, his Italian veterans, the heart of his army, placed where he believed they could strike at the crucial moment. Scipio, in contrast, had an army well-balanced and carefully arranged. His infantry, veterans of Spain and Africa, formed the core, their discipline unmatched after years of relentless campaigning. Massinissa, now king of the eastern Numidians, brought with him thousands of horsemen, swift and deadly. On the Roman left, Laelius commanded the allied cavalry, and together the mounted wings outnumbered Hannibal's. Scipio organized his maniples in an unorthodox fashion, leaving wide lanes between them, gaps that seemed dangerous but were intended for a purpose. The battle began with the elephants. Trumpets and horns sounded as the massive creatures lumbered forward, their tusks sharpened, their riders urging them against the Roman line. Dust rose in great clouds as they charged, but Scipio's design now revealed itself. Instead of a solid wall of shields, the Roman maniples stood apart, lanes yawning between them. Into these corridors the elephants were channeled, confused and funneled harmlessly through. Trumpeters blared, startling the beasts further, while javelins and spears pierced their hides. Some elephants wheeled back in panic, crashing into Hannibal's own cavalry on the left, throwing the Carthaginian ranks into chaos. Then the cavalry clashed. Massinissa and Laelius spurred their horsemen forward, thundering into Hannibal's mounted wings. The Numidian cavalry, once Carthage's greatest asset, now fought for Rome, and their speed and maneuvering overwhelmed the Carthaginian riders. The field resounded with the screams of horses and the clash of steel as Hannibal's cavalry was driven from the field, pursued far away by Massinissa and Laelius. With the elephants routed and the cavalry gone, the battle became one of infantry. The mercenaries at the front engaged first, hurling themselves upon the Roman legions. They fought fiercely, Gauls swinging longswords, Ligurians thrusting spears, Numidians darting with javelins. Yet the Romans held firm, shields locked, swords stabbing, pressing forward in disciplined formation. When the mercenaries broke, many turned upon the Carthaginian citizen soldiers behind them, furious at being abandoned, and disorder spread in the Carthaginian lines. Still, Hannibal's veterans waited. They had seen worse, endured worse, and they remained steady, their gaze fixed upon the Roman legions advancing steadily across the field. Scipio, cautious, reformed his ranks before engaging them, refusing to rush headlong into the trap of Hannibal's most experienced troops. Only when his lines were prepared did he give the signal, and the final clash began. The veterans of Hannibal met the veterans of Scipio in a struggle that shook the earth. Sword against sword, shield against shield, they fought with relentless fury. For a time neither side gave ground, and the outcome hung in the balance. Hannibal himself moved among his men, urging them on, reminding them of past glories, of victories that had brought Rome to its knees. Scipio, too, strode before his lines, his presence steadying the men who knew that all of Rome's future depended upon them. Then, at the moment when the struggle seemed most even, the thunder of hooves returned. Massinissa and Laelius, having routed the Carthaginian cavalry, now swept back onto the battlefield. Their horsemen crashed into Hannibal's rear, striking the veterans from behind. Surrounded, pressed on all sides, the Carthaginian line buckled. The discipline that had held so long gave way at last, and the slaughter began. Tens of thousands fell. The veterans who had marched with Hannibal from Spain, who had endured the snows of the Alps, who had triumphed at Cannae, now perished upon African soil. Hannibal, seeing the day lost, escaped with a small guard, retreating toward Carthage. But the war was over. The aftermath was grim. Carthage, defeated, sued for peace. Rome dictated the terms, harsh and uncompromising. Carthage was stripped of her fleet, save a handful of ships. Her overseas territories were lost, her independence shackled. An indemnity of 10,000 talents was demanded, to be paid over 50 years. And most galling of all, Carthage could wage no war without Rome's permission. Carthage remained standing, but she was no longer a rival, no longer a power. For Rome, the victory was more than survival. It was a triumph that marked the beginning of true empire. No longer merely the master of Italy, Rome now stood as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean, her legions feared, her name respected. Scipio returned to Rome in glory, granted the agnomen Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. His name would forever be linked with the destruction of Carthage's greatness. And yet, amid the celebrations, one could not help but reflect on the man who had come so close to undoing Rome. Hannibal Barca, though defeated, remained a figure of awe. His genius had shaken the Republic to its foundations, and though the war was lost, his legend endured. In the struggle between these two titans, Rome had been tempered in fire, emerging stronger than before. The Second Punic War was over, but its memory would never fade. It was the war that had nearly destroyed Rome, the war that had carried elephants over the Alps, that had slaughtered legions at Cannae, that had seen Italy itself ravaged. And in its end, it was the war that had ensured Rome's supremacy for centuries to come. The dust of Zama had barely settled when the fate of the ancient Mediterranean shifted forever. Carthage, once the mistress of the seas, humbled Rome, and nearly triumphant, now lay broken. Her walls still stood, her harbors still bustled, but the spirit that had once dared to challenge the Republic was crushed beneath the weight of defeat. The treaty imposed by Scipio and ratified in Rome stripped Carthage of everything that had made her dangerous. Without her fleet, her silver mines, or her freedom to make war, she became a client bound to Roman will. Carthage endured, but only as a shadow of her former glory. In Rome, the victory unleashed a wave of pride and expansionist ambition. Scipio returned in triumph, hailed as Africanus, his name forever linked with the conquest of Carthage. His procession through the streets of Rome was a spectacle, the people cheering, the Senate honoring, the gods praised for the salvation of the Republic. But even as the city celebrated, the war had left deep marks. Hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost, whole regions of Italy ravaged, allies tested to the brink of rebellion. Rome had survived the greatest trial in her history, but she was no longer the Rome of old. She had emerged harder, more ruthless, and with eyes set upon empire. Hannibal Barca did not vanish with defeat. For a time he remained in Carthage, a statesman rather than a general, attempting to reform the city that he had long fought for. He curbed corruption, reorganized taxes, and worked to rebuild Carthage's strength under the shadow of Rome's restrictions. But his enemies in the Senate feared him, and Roman suspicion never lifted. Eventually, under pressure from Rome, Hannibal went into exile. His later years were spent wandering the courts of the Eastern Mediterranean, a soldier without a war, a commander without an army. He advised kings, lent his wisdom to rulers who still dreamed of resisting Rome, and even fought once more in distant lands. But Rome's reach was long, and wherever he went, her envoys demanded his surrender. Hannibal, unwilling to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, chose his own fate. Taking poison, he ended his life with the same defiance that had marked his youth. According to legend, his last words declared that Rome would never rest while Hannibal lived. The war he had waged left a legacy that far outlived both him and Scipio. The Second Punic War had revealed the heights of human courage and the depths of human suffering. It had shown the brilliance of strategy and the cruelty of fortune. It had brought Rome to the brink of annihilation and then elevated her to supremacy. For the peoples of the Mediterranean, it was an age of fire, of cities destroyed, of alliances broken, of lives consumed in the clash of two titans. And yet, beyond the numbers of the dead and the ruins left behind, it was also a war of individuals, of two men whose destinies were intertwined. Hannibal and Scipio, the one born to avenge, the other born to redeem. Their duel defined an era, their choices reshaped the map of the world. In their struggle, the fate of empires was decided. The Mediterranean that emerged from the Second Punic War was one where Rome could no longer be challenged in the west. Spain became hers, Africa bent beneath her power. Italy remained loyal despite its agony. Carthage, though still breathing, would never again rise as an equal. In time, Rome would return to finish what had begun at Zama, reducing the proud city to ashes. But even before that final destruction, the war had already ended Carthage's age of greatness. For Rome, it was the beginning of something far larger than the senators or soldiers could yet imagine. The Republic, hardened by the trial, would march eastward into Greece and Asia, bringing her legions into the heart of the Hellenistic world. The discipline, resilience, and ambition forged in the struggle against Hannibal became the foundation of empire. The Second Punic War was more than a contest between states. It was a struggle for survival, for dominance, for the soul of the Mediterranean. It was a war that taught Rome the price of endurance and taught Carthage the cost of defiance. It was the war that had nearly destroyed Rome, and in so nearly destroying her had made her unstoppable. And so the tale ends, not with the silence of peace, but with the echo of destiny. Rome and Carthage, their names forever bound, their rivalry etched into history. From the snows of the Alps to the plains of Zama, from the oath of a boy at an altar to the triumph of a general in Rome. It was an age when giants walked the earth, and the world was remade in their shadow.